Good evening, everyone. Can I ask you please to take your seats? Good evening. It is such a pleasure always to see this hall full. I would like to welcome all of you to the 31st Pietro Belluschi lecture presented by Sir David Chipperfield. In the small chance I don't know you, I think I know many of you. I'm Nicholas DeMoncho, Department Head of the Department of Architecture here at MIT. I will start with a few words about both Pietro Belluschi and David Chipperfield, and a final word from me before we begin. Pietro Belluschi served as the Dean of the MIT School in Architecture and Planning from 1951 to 1965. Born in Italy, he was educated at the University of Rome and Cornell, and he started his career at the office of A. Doyle in Portland, Oregon. After Doyle's death in 1928, Belluschi became chief designer and in 1943 brought the firm under his own name. At either end of a remarkable career in Portland stand notable buildings, beginning with the Portland Art Museum of 1931 and ending with the Equitable Building of 1948. At that point, Belluschi was selected to succeed William Worcester as dean at MIT. And he gave a convocation speech at Reed College in that year, anticipating his new work in words that resonate today. In these dark times, we have a greater need of faith in the future than ever. But I persist in the view that in all these events are the foundations of a new Renaissance. It may not be for us to see it, and we must likely reckon in generations for its flowering, but I believe a better environment for a happier mankind is in the making. It is for this reason, Belluschi continued, and in this hope that I have elected to take part in education. I look with great misgivings at my accomplishments of the past, full as they are of compromises, failings in their goals. Yet I have never doubted that there were ideals to sustain, and these I hope to transmit to a new generation. In this spirit, late in his life, Dean Belluschi and his family made a gift to MIT to establish this lecture. The roster of previous lecturers includes Alvaro Siza, Cayuzo Sejima, Tom Main, Peter Zumthor, Alejandro Aravena, Rafael Moneo, Jeannie Gang, Walter Hood, Todd Williams and Billy Sien, Amal Andreas, Leslie Loco, and Solano Benitez. To all these names, and in the spirit to which the Belluschi lecture was endowed, I am now particularly delighted to add that of Sir David Chipperfield. I have been deeply aware of and deeply admiring of David's work since I began my career in London in the mid-1990s. It's actually very hard to describe now, when we take the word as part of a shared contemporary canon, how very new buildings like the 1997 River and Rowing Museum in Henley seemed at the time. In the then hangover from postmodernism and the formalisms that followed it, the combination of lightness, precision, and coherence presented the most powerful case for architecture's role in the world. That is, to make the world more legible, more beautiful, and provide for essential possibilities that would not exist without it. It was only a year later, in 1998, that David's office surprised all of its more established competitors to begin over 20 years of work transforming one of the most difficult and complex institutional sites imaginable, the recently united Berlin's Museumsinsel, into, as it was my pleasure to witness a few years ago, playing hooky with John Oxendorf from a fundraising trip, one of the most remarkable examples I've ever seen of architecture's ability to bring coherence, calm, and even delight across seemingly impossible physical, institutional, and even social barriers. A project that moves beyond the idea of building as an object and moves towards it very much as a verb, bringing together not just physical entities, but institutional and political ones as well. So, for a more formal bio, and we'll end this soon, David Chipperfield studied architecture at the Kingston School of Art and the Architectural Association. He worked for Richard Rogers and Norman Foster before founding his own practice in 1985, now with 5 offices in London, Berlin, Milan, Shanghai, and Santiago de Compostela. He is a member of the RIBA and an honorary fellow of both the AIA and the Bund Deutscher Architekten. He's received the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, a knighthood for services to architecture in the UK and Germany, and he has received the RIBA Gold Medal for Architecture and Praemium Imperiale from the Japanese Art Association. He was appointed a member of the UK's Companion of Honor in 2021, commander of Spain's Orden de Isabel la Católica, and is a member of Germany's Orden pour le Mérite for Wissenschaften, I'm going to garble this one, und Künste in 2022. In 2023, of course, he was selected laureate for the Pritzker Architecture Prize. David has also served as curator of the 13th Architecture Exhibition of the Venice Biennale under the title Common Ground, joined in his team by our own Jeffra Kolb. And he served as a mentor for the 2016-2017 Rolex Mentor and Protege Arts Initiative. In 2017, he founded Fundación RIA, a private nonprofit entity that works towards meaningful economic, environmental, and cultural development in Galicia, Spain, leading directly to his collaboration with our current series of option studios led by Roy Salguero Barrio. Which brings us back to tonight, and the very fitting conclusion to our lecture series this year, which is also my last lecture as department head, and if you can believe it, the last lecture of the Department of Architecture in this room as we move to our own large lecture hall in the Metropolitan Warehouse next year. In the last years, which continue to challenge us to imagine our profession anew, the coherence and clarity of David's work is for me the most appropriate and elegant milestone that I can imagine. Please join me in doing 2 things. First of all, thanking Joelle Corella, who has made this lecture series happen across this year and the last couple of years with enormous professionalism and care. And 2, in that round of applause, also welcoming Sir David Chipperfield. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. First of all, I want to thank you for this invitation to talk tonight. I'm honored to give this talk in memory of Pietro Belluschi, who made such a strong contribution to American architectural culture, both as a successful practitioner, as an educator, especially here as Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning. I'd also like to thank MIT School of Architecture and Planning, and do we call it MISTI or MISTI, for their, sorry, that's my place, for their support. And to the Leventhal Center for the ongoing collaboration with Fundación RIA, and especially the personal support of Alicia Goldstein-Round and Roy Salguero. And we look forward to our ongoing relationship together. I have to admit that I find it increasingly difficult to give lectures about my work. It doesn't get any easier, strangely. In fact, it sort of gets more difficult. As a young architect, you sort of have the enthusiasm to try and convince everybody in your talents, and it becomes, in a way, a bit of self-definition and to some degree self-promotion that we need as architects to develop our practice. As architects, we are rewarded by the satisfaction of seeing our ideas being realized, by the energy of projects, positive and negative. Being invited to give a lecture is a privileged way of sharing that journey, of being listened to within a generous environment amongst colleagues and students who hopefully share concerns, and ambitions. It is an opportunity to give more precise shape to a less shaped process. The work of a studio isn't always very coherent, and a lecture is an opportunity to try to give more order to one's ideas, and through the need to explain, become clearer about one's own motives and motivations. My struggle is not one based in any sort of professional tiredness or disillusionment. On the contrary, I'm more excited and committed about the responsibility of being an architect than ever. The most comfortable and straightforward way for us to talk about our work is by showing built projects or proposals to illustrate ideas of practice and architecture. While still believing that through architecture we can inspire, I feel that we operate at a moment where we have too willingly accepted the atomization of our society, and that we must find ways of fighting against this through the way we work. We can no longer feel comfortable advocating practice only through the achievement of singular buildings. As a profession, we are at a time when we have to think harder than we have ever had to before, not only about the immediate task and our ability to be creative within its limits, but about what contribution our buildings make towards the increasing challenges we face socially and environmentally. I believe that as architects we have a responsibility to remind ourselves of the collective potential of architecture as well as the independent power of individual projects. What I'm meaning by that, and simply put, is that I guess 20 years ago I would have stood here and flicked through a number of recent projects and explained them one by one. I think that, and I will, don't worry, I will show you some projects. But clearly, the landscape has changed, our world has changed, and our responsibilities as architects have changed within that, and that's something that I will talk about tonight. I was taught by a generation of architects, a generation of idealists, post-war architects who felt that their work as architects and planners was to build a better world. They carried on the ideals of the early modern movement, the heroic but also humanist vision of modern architecture. We all of us have inherited this idea that our profession, while being profoundly practical, is motivated or should be motivated by ideals. Those ideals concern beauty, a beauty that is focused on how we build and what we need in a way that conveys these aspirations. The buildings in history that inspire us are not those that are solely technically or formally innovative, but rather those that seem to unite our practical, social, and emotional aspirations in material form. As architects, we cannot be expected to be much better than the society we serve. While we like to think that we sit above the unimaginative, mediocre, and mundane concerns of society, often with some sense of superiority, we cannot actually free ourselves from the conditions within which we must operate. We encourage ourselves with the idea of the heroic figure, a myth of the modern movement, and one that is weakly maintained in the idea of the star architect. But the reality is that we operate within the political, moral, and social limits of the society within which we live. With beautiful buildings, we can create moments of relief and inspiration, but we cannot imagine that this is our only role as architects, only operating in comfortable conditions where the value of our involvement can be justified. This should be no surprise, but we seem to struggle with this reality because we have lost the confidence of our society as a whole, along with our status in it. We are no longer trusted to give vision or to be part of planning our physical world. We find ourselves having to operate within a vision of the world that responds to greater forces and different priorities than those that motivate us. We might give shape to buildings and participate in the promotion of real estate or institutions, but not to the environment they make or to the world that most of us live in. We seem to work against prevailing forces as a sort of guerrilla activity, satisfied by the opportunity to make creative statements of architectural form. Has this not always been the truth? Of course, but now we live in a world where actions are of a different scale and decisions have profound effect on our environment. Local decisions tend to be connected and dominated by global forces. In the meantime, and I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic, it will get better, I assure you. In the meantime, we are for the first time really questioning the previously accepted premise of progress. This is not just a philosophical doubt. All generations have lamented the loss of qualities of previous times. Our reflection on progress is not based only on social or political issues, but the realization that through progress, we are destroying the physical world that has protected us so well until now. Paradoxically, it means that those of us based in professions that have influence in how we build our world, where we build, who we build for, and what we build with, have a greater responsibility, a greater mandate to act and lead than we ever had. But as I said, our feet, if not our heads, are firmly stuck in the society that we operate in. And let's be clear that as a profession we depend on. We are not free artists, free to roam intellectually and morally. We cannot act without request and support. Unfortunately, now we need not just to serve the needs of the society we serve and the requests of those that employ us, but to question them at the same time. In order to influence, we have to at the same time wrestle back the responsibility and the trust we need. This is an image of London's skyline. It could be any city, and perhaps in a North American context, maybe this is not so shocking. But in London it is. It is the view out of the window of my former office. And it obviously represents the idea that the contemporary city is formed by commercial forces. It has ever been so. But now the scale of those forces, the global dimensions of these forces, means that neither the people who live there or work there, nor in fact the architects who design the buildings, have any real influence on the shape or character and therefore the ideals of the city. As architects, all we can do is decorate it. Nicer shapes, interesting facade systems. Perhaps we must accept this as a contemporary transaction, where the idea of the city as a place of diversity, social, cultural, and commercial complexity is lost and replaced by a new exciting model. Do we accept the transformation of the traditional city into a contemporary one is inevitable? I mean, should we accept that the transformation of the traditional city into a contemporary one is inevitable, and that we have surrendered in some sort of Faustian deal for a more convenient life, and that architecture is now a complicit and honest representation of our new values? That the city is no longer given shape by local forces and concerns, but rather it is the consequence of free market commercialism, that architecture is one more commodity. Perhaps if this vision wasn't so profoundly linked with the consequences of social insecurity and environmental crisis, we might be more forgiving towards this vision, or rather, non-vision. The loss of confidence in urban planning, both as an ideological and cynical position based on the poor results of post-war planning projects and the intolerance of the free market to be restricted by regulation and control beyond the rules and opportunities of market has left us nearly hopeless in the face of environmental and social crisis we face. How can we tackle the issue of resources, of carbon emission, the tragic erosion of biodiversity, or the equally existential crisis of social inequality and quality of life for huge parts of society, even in the so-called prosperous societies such as the UK and the US, if we don't start here? Both of these images illustrate another reality of our situation. The private sector, investment, drives development, and the public sector that has in the past, offered some checks on such things, has no power and probably little interest. We have to believe, against belief, that it is possible to encourage new systems of planning and governance that take on the responsibility of guiding private investment and innovation, not solely for those who profit, but for the common good. Whatever critique we might have, whatever expectations we have of architecture, we can never lose sight of the joy of the physical stuff of architecture itself, of building, making spaces. We should never underestimate the importance of why and what we do. We are entrusted to promote this importance, of the importance of the practical act of making shelter in its diverse roles and circumstances. Promote it not for itself, but for its physical and social potential. I must confess to being tired of the type of architecture that is dedicated to branding, promoting the wealth of the client, the creativity of the architect, or the desirability of one more luxury housing project. I'm also totally guilty of being complicit in all of the above. However, I'm not tired of buildings that show ideas of how we might live together better, or how we might build more beautifully, and how we might conceive and construct with more care towards the world we live. So I'm going to show a few projects so you don't get too disappointed that I don't show any architecture, but I'm picking out a few projects over the years of our studio. This is a project we did in Valencia for the America's Cup. It was commissioned by the city of Valencia when the America's Cup went to Valencia for one session. And this was meant to be a VIP building, and we persuaded the city that instead of doing a VIP building, it should, by its architecture, become more open and more permeable to the people of Valencia. In our studio over many years, we have been fortunate to find commissions and clients and opportunities to develop ideas of architecture. Ideas of architecture is something I would hope that is close to a craft. We have sought out, where possible, to find projects that are, by their function, orientated towards social program. I'm showing a few images of these projects as I explain. The very brief selection is a sort of show and tell of projects that I consider contain ideas of construction, material space, and mostly ideas of social purpose. Clearly, there is an enormous privilege of doing a lot of museums. Museums come with the gift of public purpose. This was one we did in St. Louis in a complex condition as an extension to the Cass Gilbert building. That's the remaining building of the World's Fair, St. Louis World's Fair, and in this very prominent position in Forest Park. One of the interesting things of working in institutions like this is that the project tends to start off with sort of exotic ideas of architectural extensions and needing more space, but in fact they become opportunities to reorganize and for organizations like St. Louis, this was very interesting, in a way to sort of rethink their campus, and this was something we did. It was a complicated project to sit next to the very exotic building of Cass Gilbert and to create a sort of modern extension, and especially to create a museum in a park. Museums, by definition, tend to be quite closed, introverted, and we created this series of buildings that looked out onto the park, and where all the spaces were flooded with top light. A private house in England, I guess demonstrating, certain architectural, physical qualities about, one of the challenges we have, I think, within architecture is to deal with a sort of loss of craftsmanship or a sort of the dominance of the project management of the whole construction process, the de-skilling of the way we build, and through that, the sort of physical qualities. And I think that's one of the things that we dedicate ourselves a lot to making sure that buildings fulfill their sort of physical promise. This is a housing project in the East End of London where we built these 2 towers in brick. Another museum in the north of England, Wakefield. This is the Hepworth Museum. Wakefield was the birthplace of Barbara Hepworth, and this museum was commissioned in her memory. A building in Seoul, Amoy Pacific headquarters, for an extraordinary, interesting client who, the building is enormous. It's the biggest building we've ever done. And the commission was for a tower. And the client, who was the owner of the company, and it's a family company. It's the 3rd generation of a beauty products company. Actually, 2nd generation. His mother started it by making camellia oil and selling it to American GIs after the Korean War. And from that, he's built this enormous company. And he was very concerned to make a building that represented a home for the people, the 3,000 people that were going to work there. And so in the competition, we said that you can't do that with a tower. A tower is not a form that allows you to create a place. All you have is a lobby and an elevator and lots of floors. So we managed to come with a completely different idea, which was a building that held this garden and a series of public spaces. So that was. I was able to go back to Japan not so long ago to work again. I started my career in Japan. My first buildings were there, and this was a building for a cemetery near Kyoto. And we are working more and more with reusing buildings. This used to be an administrative building in the center of Paris, and we've converted it under the previous mayor's program and Hidalgo's program of public works. And she and her administration were very supportive of projects which reused existing buildings. Another reuse, this was a ministry in Qatar, in Doha, and we converted it into a hotel. So even in environments like the Middle East, they are taking the idea of reusing buildings quite seriously. Over the years, we built many projects in many countries, but perhaps the project that helped form our practice and develop our approach to architecture was the reconstruction of the Neues Museum in Berlin, won through a series of competitions from 1994 to 1997. The original building was not only an important part of the 19th century German architectural history, but by its ruination, by bombing in the Second World War, and its subsequent neglect through the tumultuous post-war years, it became a symbol of the German traumatic history of the 20th century. Then the reunification of Germany and the rebuilding of the divided city of Berlin meant that it once again became symbolic of the issues of contemporary German history and reunification. So this is the building. You might, those of you that know Berlin, this is the Pergamon, the Old National Gallery, and Schinkel's famous Alters Museum is here. This was by Stuller's student, and this was the Egyptian Museum. Like the whole of Berlin, it was extremely badly bombed during the war, and unlike its neighboring buildings, it was not restored. So the Pergamon was rebuilt, the Alters National Gallery was rebuilt, and so was Schinkel's, the Old National Gallery, and so was Alters Museum by Schinkel, all rebuilt rather poorly during the GDR period. But Neues Museum stood as a ruin. And so it stood as a ruin for more than 40 years. With the reunification, then Berlin again had to reinvent itself, and projects like this became critical to that reinvention. I show this project for a number of reasons. Most importantly, it is a project that allowed us to develop not only ideas about the project itself, but its challenges, technical, intellectual, emotional, and political, forced us to develop an attitude of how we develop ideas and how we engage with others, not only clients, but historians, conservationists, city architects, politicians, and with the emotions of the citizens. It was a project of such complexity that it couldn't be conceived in isolation from the various representatives, nor could it be realized only through conventional professional processes. The project needed to be a shared project. The ideas needed to appeal to others. Architecture was the tool to realize collective ideas and deal with collective anxieties. It was an extremely controversial project, and in a way, the strategy that we proposed made the project more controversial. It's very accepted, or has always been very accepted in recent times, that one way to deal with a building like this is essentially rebuild it. And in that process, you lose so much of the original fabric. And this building had become something quite extraordinary in its 40 years as a ruin. It had been a ruin as long as it had been a building, an occupied building, or nearly. And therefore, there was something that I felt shouldn't be lost in that process. The atmosphere in Germany, but especially Berlin, in the years after the fall of the wall were quite special. The city had been split into two, and the two parts had developed separately and differently over the 40 years of the GDR and nearly 30 years of the physical separation by the wall and all of its complementary machinery. The task for Berlin was to reunify physical and social infrastructure, politically, culturally, a program complex and still unfinished. In this, the replanning of the city and the reconstruction, especially in the neglected areas of the east and of course the zone of the wall, and no man's land that created a great urban scar, was critical, both practically and representationally. The commission of Neues Museum placed us in the very center of this fascinating condition, in a city having to once again define itself. The condition of the city, two cities, and of the buildings became an issue not only of real estate, but of meaning, and the program of construction, reconstruction became its own unique story. From the first competition of the Neues Museum in 1994, we were fortunate to be located in the center of this story. We undertook many projects during the long planning and realization of the Neues Museum project and master planning of Museum Island. The atmosphere was heightened and everything meant something. Coming from London and its real estate mentality, it was exciting to be engaged in projects that had meaning beyond the concerns of the clients. Every project had a responsibility to the collective task of reconstruction. Berlin of those years acted like all cities should act, with reflection and concern about what each building means to the whole. When the wall came down, the task of reunification was a profound one. If you can imagine that for 40 years, these two parts, 30 years physically, had been separated. So all infrastructure had been separated, all sewage systems, or subway systems, all cultural institutions, and et cetera, et cetera. But also, in the eastern sector, there were large areas of the city which had been had been neglected, and so, in a strange way, Berlin was once again having to reinvent itself. It's a city of reinvention. It always has been, and in that reinvention, it was incredibly self-conscious about its history. And strangely, the things which had been damaged in the war, which had been artificially left alone and neglected in the GDR sector, were, as it were, ruins out of their time. They were sort of archaeological fragments. And in this collective task of rethinking and rebuilding a city, both divided and in pieces, every project took on an extraordinary sensitivity. I mean, there was a heightened sensitivity, and of course, the Germans all, it was also drew upon a certain thoroughness that the Germans might bring to such things. So it was, I would have to say, a sort of delight to work in this type of environment where everything meant something. Keeping things meant something. So little had survived, so fragments meant something. We did many projects. This is one of them. It's an old school. But similarly, they were not immune from the issues of needing investors to come in and try and build things, but at the same time, they needed to think about how to protect memory and, in a way, reinvent a city from the fragments. So projects like this, where we restored the building and we managed to add things on, these were projects that we did which were incredibly complicated. They contained layers, different layers of history. Even even parts of the building which had, so originally it was a 19th century building. This is, I'm showing you a different building now. This is a building next to the river. It was originally a 19th century building. There had been some 1920s additions, and then it had been bombed, and then during the GDR they'd added some things. Each layer of those additions, even rather ugly additions of the 1970s, now had a sort of historical value. So these projects, which we did many of them during these years, were quite rigorously thought about, and we had to take positions in terms of what we kept, how we added, in what way could we add. The idea of which is an inherited modern movement idea that everything new must look new and everything old must look old, it was something we sort of rejected in the reality of these conditions, and we enjoyed very much this melting together of these different concerns and conditions. This was a small museum we did opposite the museum island. This working with what was there, of finding the project, became a sort of methodology which we have worked with not only in Berlin. This is in Paderborn, in southern Germany, where we restored an old a cloister, an old convent, which had been again layered with other additions, and I think what's interesting, when we started these projects in the late 90s, the motivation in Berlin was to reuse, but the reuse was not about material. It was not to do with sustainability. It was about memory, and it was about meaning. So it was something which, of course, now we're doing more and more of, but it began. This is the Royal Academy in London, where we also worked in this type of excavating way of finding the project within the building. I think this attitude was something that we developed through the work in Berlin, and I think this changed very much the way we came to projects. This is in Venice at Procuratia in St. Mark's Square, where we restored the north side of St. Mark's Square. We're working in Brescia. This is the amphitheatre in Brescia, which we're in the middle of starting to restore. So back to Neues Museum. Sorry if I can find the right. This shows the condition of the building that we inherited. So it had remained like this since 1945, and you can see that the levels of damage are complicated. There are pieces which are completely missing, and yet on the other hand, there are pieces remaining. Inside, this is the main staircase hall. The parts of the building were missing, but in other places, wall paintings were still in place, and even glass windows were still totally intact. So the damage was inconsistent. Our attitude was to repair the building like a piece of archaeology, that as a museum of archaeology, it seemed to us that the last thing you should do is destroy the object in the way you repair it or the way you rebuild it. If this had been a painting or Greek sculpture, you would try to clean it, repair it, and intervene only insofar that you want to suppress the damage. When we won the competition, we had no idea how to do any of this, and it was really a sort of journey of innocence. We had no idea. I had no idea what the final result would be, but we protected the project by a sort of a philosophical approach, and that approach was that nothing that had survived should be removed, but that everything that had survived should be reframed and made sense of. In other words, if you take this room, a room which faces to the east garden, it was a sort of garden room. You can see here there was some decoration of a trellis and grapes, and you can see some blue, so there used to be a sort of blue decorated ceiling. All of these rooms were highly decorated. So there's some fragments left, but clearly you can't leave this space in that way. What we did was to photograph every wall, every floor, every ceiling, every piece of the building, and we put these on a sort of paint box, and then we speculated on computer what level of restoration we could do that kept the original fabric, but at the same time created a context for that damage. So you can see that by a soft covering up of things, a slight wash of blue here, all of a sudden the blue is contextualized. We did this for every part of the building. We had to do this type of drawing to understand damage, and then how we would do completion. And this is a series of images that just show you how that works. So this is the southeast corner. The space beyond was totally missing. You can see here that there are pieces of decoration still existing. The brick domes, some places existing and other places completely missing. We reconstructed the domes. We used the same tectonic device and we made clay bricks, clay pots. We got someone to make nearly 1 million clay pots by hand. Stuller had made this very lightweight construction because of the instability of the soil. And we took these spaces gradually from a ruined condition to something that became complete. You can imagine that the process of getting to that point is quite a complex one. It's not something you can do in an office. It's not something that you can have approval for, pre-approval, or so every decision. You can imagine this is in the German system. So the German system is extremely administrative. Every decision has to be approved. So the exercise was one of enormous collaboration. I would say that the achievement of this project, if there's any, was not necessarily the conventional ones of being an architect, but ones of collective intelligence and collective participation, from museum directors to historians to restoration experts. And this project was done under the watch of everybody. And it was done under the watch of the general public. there was a lot of reaction against the project. This was a poster. There was a public demonstration on many occasions against the project. There was petitions to Parliament, and this simply says, it's a very reasonable question. Wouldn't you prefer to have this back? This is how it used to be, or Chipperfield's horrible concrete monstrosity? And of course, if I was a citizen, I would ask the same question. Why can't we just have it back like it was? We have the drawings and we could copy. And of course, the argument I had to make was that you have lost the original, and whatever we put back can only be fake, and in that you humiliate the authenticity of everything else that has survived. So we keep everything which has survived, and we try to make sense of the pieces which have survived by the new interventions, but we don't do that. It did require an enormous amount of dialogue, not only with administrations, but with the citizens. I was shouted at in the street. We had public demonstrations. We had candlelit demonstrations at night. And I had to explain the project continuously for nearly 12 years. The project took 6 years planning and 6 years building. It was something absolutely symbolic to the reconstruction. And my German friends kept apologizing to me and saying, we're so sorry you have to go through all of this stuff. And my argument always, and I think it's why I survived, was that if you expect people to be, if we want as architects people to be interested in architecture, then we have to expect them to be interested in architecture. We should celebrate the fact that they're interested in architecture. And of course, it's not going to always be convenient. They think exactly the same as you, but I think personally, I found it very encouraging that people felt so strongly about architecture. This is an image from the newspaper. The day of the soft opening, there was a 4-hour. Here it says 10,000 people standing in a queue to go in, and there was a lot of anticipation that there was going to be a lot of rejection of the building, and people, even the guards, were warned how to deal with people being violent, as it was, and this reports in a very positive way. The building was totally well received and became very well received, and Angela Merkel, the Chancellor at the time, opened the building. It was seen to be a way of dealing with this traumatic history and the building. As I tried to say, I think that the project was the result not of, clearly it was a result of an approach, and I can take credit for that. But I think in terms of a sort of philosophical attitude to how you might deal with ruination. But from then on, it was the success was the process, was the engagement with everybody. I sat the first weeks or first months of the project. We sat in meetings with different people, all having different opinions and all getting rather aggressive about their opinions. And finally, I said, "This is crazy. I don't know what to do. Let's all sit in the same room, and you can explain to curators can explain why they want this to happen, and engineers can explain why they want this to happen." And we formed a type of executive system of making decisions in a very collaborative way. And I would have to say it was not a very German system. They were very surprised at this, and it created a result that everybody felt engaged in. The theme of my talk, in a way, as you've sort of probably understood by now, is a sort of anxiety about how, as architects, we have managed over the last 30 or 40 years to keep ourselves amused by doing good buildings, museums and different things, and the health of architecture through publications might be seen to be rather good. I would certainly say there are some extraordinarily good buildings being built everywhere, and maybe of a higher quality than they were being built 30 or 40 years ago. On the other hand, I would sort of make a slightly exaggerated argument that architecture has become a sort of rarefied commodity and survives only in a rarefied atmosphere. That while we can see really interesting singular projects, we have to admit that most of the world that we build and the world that we expect people to live in has been poorly considered, even neglected. There are parts of England which are just shamefully bad. There are new parts of all of our cities which are cynical in terms of the way that they're built. They have no qualities at all. And one has to ask whether we should be measuring the architectural contribution by museums and opera houses and the occasional good project, or by our general influence on society. So when I was invited to be the director of the Architecture Biennale, I insisted that I wanted to make a theme, because at that point the themes had been a little bit spurious, I would say. Biennale had tended to be a showroom of talent, and quite rightly. I mean, it gave architects the opportunity to show their work. But I felt that for my Biennale, I would prefer to ask my colleagues not to show how good they were individually, but to see whether we couldn't present ourselves in a slightly more collective way. In other words, not what we did individually, but what does architecture, what can architecture contribute to the common good. Common ground was actually Richard Sennett worked with me on the idea, and he came up with this title, was of course the idea of common ground being a reference to a common good, but also within the profession, things that we shared amongst ourselves, and in ways that we can demonstrate our use towards society. So I insisted that all the architects, they could show projects, but the projects had to be justified by the theme. And with maybe two exceptions, 103 architects played along very well. Some I had to go and see 2 or 3 times. I had to go and see Zaha 3 times in order to get her to do something I think was very nice in the end. She showed, I mean, she began with an opera house and said, well, this is common ground because people go to it. And I said, well, that's not quite enough, Zaha. And finally, she showed her project, but actually she showed a lot of projects of people who had influenced her, engineers that had influenced her, buildings that had influenced her, and students and other architects who she had influenced, which I thought was very reasonable and probably as good as I could get from Zaha. But it showed, her idea was that there are, her thought was that there are ideas which we share, and she wanted to show the commonality of those ideas. This is the room of Herzog Demeron. They showed their opera house in Hamburg, but actually the way they showed it, the wall is newspaper articles, German newspaper articles mostly protesting against the project. So, so what they wanted to show was the difficulty of delivering a public project of this scale in a society like Hamburg. And in fact, it was interesting, even the administration came to the exhibition, and Jack and Pierre had meetings with because at this point the project was in doubt, and it was a room where they actually could, as it were, express the issues of doing a public project. I'm going to go quickly now through the last section. So I would say that let me find my piece. So like so many of my professional colleagues across the world, we have as a studio tried to respond more seriously to concerns of sustainability and the consideration of resources. Within the constraints of conventional practice, we try to fight for ideas of reuse and sustainability. It is encouraging to see so many offices taking up this challenge, and we are beginning to see real progress. However, we must concede that the issues that really influence how we develop and protect our environment are decided before we as architects get involved. The territory we operate within does not give us real scope to have real influence. We have to find ways of being involved much further upstream. This means becoming more involved in planning strategies and policy. The question isn't only how do we build. We can't solve everything with that. In other words, just using the right materials or reusing materials is important, but isn't going to solve the problem. Rather, we have to become more involved in decisions about what do we build, where do we build, who do we build for, etc. We need the framework and protection of proactive planning strategies. We have witnessed everywhere over my lifetime the gradual erosion of planning structures, only to leave planning administrations with negative powers, mostly about protection of particular areas and concerns. To be clear, we should not confuse planning regulations and restrictions, which are in place as safeguards. We are talking about proactive planning that considers future development and infrastructure as integrated process. Over the years, we've witnessed a soft conspiracy between a number of factors. Firstly, ideological. The free market doesn't encourage any more restrictions than already exists. Secondly, it requires investment in the public sector, which itself has been squeezed of resources. And finally, there's a lack of confidence about who might do the planning, who would have the authority to make such decisions. We have seen everywhere an erosion of confidence in professional expertise. To repeat an earlier point, if we were only talking, as we have done as a profession, about how sad it is we make such poor decisions, how we have eroded the qualities of our cities, towns, and landscape, if this was only an issue of accepting the realities of our time, but is not, it's fundamental to finding ways by which we might start seriously tackling the existential challenges of environmental, territorial, and social erosion. This is a modest project we're doing in London, the London School of Economics. We want the building in the middle was the subject of the competition. The LSE wanted to knock the building down, and they had a sponsor to pay for a new building. We came along and our competition submission said, you should be reusing the building. This did not amuse the sponsor, who wanted a nice new building, but the moral obligation was, in a way, difficult for them. We proved that you could reuse the building. It's an ugly building. So again, we're not reusing, we're not protecting the building because it's a good one. We're protecting the building because it's a perfectly okay one. And this just shows the process that we're going through to turn it from to get out of that building what the London School of Economics needed. it has been incredibly difficult, I have to say. I mean, we don't have the machinery in place in terms of planning, in terms of construction. At the end of this exercise, it will be shown without doubt that it would have been cheaper and easier to knock it down and start again. It's always going to be the case. However, I think what our challenge is to show that we can deliver a building of high quality, and the difference between the cost difference is something that we should be willing to surrender in terms of the gesture of reuse. And I think we have to accept at the moment a lot of these things are gestures, but we need this sort of cumulative idea of gestures. We shouldn't be doing. So, very finally, talking of gestures, nearly 10 years ago, I was asked by the President of Galicia to advise on the poor state of the built environment in Galicia. The territory is characterized by its extraordinary nature, but also with ugly buildings. I mean, they've built in the last 50 years the most appalling. I mean, you can see here, potentially quite a nice series of houses, and then, sort of monsters like this. I mean, there's been no planning control. The president was mostly concerned about the ugliness, but we were convinced, as we still are, that the ugliness is the consequence of other issues, the symptom, not the cause. I realized it was an opportunity to step outside the conventional framework of architectural practice. The invitation gave me the excuse not only to think and make suggestions about a region that I had got to know quite well and had a great deal of affection for, but it allowed me to view the role of architecture and planning from another perspective. Free of the conventional structure of professional practice, we could look at the subject from a societal one. The process started nearly 10 years ago with 3 keen young architects in my living room. And over the last 10 years, we've embraced the opportunity to look at everything that has influence on the way our built and natural landscape is developed. Now we are nearly 20 young, I'm not young, but the rest are, sitting in our headquarter building in Santiago de Compostela. Simply put, I took this as an opportunity to apply architectural perspective, and my team looking at the environment and the issues that confront the environment as a sort of public service. And also, in conventional practice, as some of you well know, you need a phone call or win a competition. You cannot just decide to go and work. In this case, we don't wait for the phone call. We provoke. So we decide there are certain projects we like to do. There are certain issues that we'd like to tackle. And so what we've done over the years is to identify issues that we felt were important. Being an autonomous region of about 2.5 million people, heavily wooded, no major metropolitan centres, it is possible to regard Galicia as a perfect laboratory. We began by looking at the urban conditions, unplanned development, a lack of protection of old buildings and public spaces dominated by cars. We also began to consider the implication of commercial activity or lack of it on the community. A place so shaped by the traditional activities of fishing, fish processing, farming, and food industries suffers enormous change when these economies change and when industrialization of production with migration of young people from the rural. One of the things that really has sort of convinced us to keep going on this, it starts with with an issue of the built environment and, a sort of irritation about why did this happen and why are they building this road here and why did they knock this building down and what, etc. Something we all do in our own towns. But there's a sort of a deeper underlying scheme behind this, I think, well, certainly from my perspective, which is that Galicia is not a rich part of Spain. Its GDP is 10% lower than any of the other Spanish autonomies. The GDP per capita is about $22,000 a year. So it's not a rich area. However, there is a declared high quality of life. If you ask people, they believe they have a good quality of life. So how does that work? The Anglo-Saxon model is that you can only really have a good quality of life if you have a lot of money. So we are very convinced that a quality of life is secured by the fortune that they have in their environment, both natural, productive landscape and the artificial landscape. And therefore, things which erode that will indeed, at the same time, erode this quality of life. So if the whole idea of sustainability is properly looked at, I would have to say that a community like this is a rather sustainable community. It produces its own food, it produces its own energy, and it has extremely modest ambitions in terms of consumption and consumerism. And in a way, surely we should all become a bit more like that. So we see this community as as something that, not from an anthropological point of view, it's a sort of protecting lost tribes or something, but that there is a sort of a simplicity and a directness of the way of life which might offer lessons. And interestingly, of course, we believe that the environment is one of the securities of that. This is what we've all been taught as architects, is that architecture, public space, environment is fundamental, and yet in most of our cities we don't provide it. So in the case of Galicia, one of our mission is to try to say that don't lose it. So we're doing a lot of projects. We've been doing this now for 10 years, and we take certain tasks. So this is a set of projects we've been doing about traffic. So here's a little nice village, and this is what happens. So the street used to be a public space. The street is a social space, and then it becomes a traffic space. And this happens throughout this region. And so we're now working on this to reduce traffic, to create places where traffic has to slow down, to take traffic away, etc. We're looking at public transport systems for rural areas, so bringing experts in from other places, doing the sort of exercises, to be honest, that administrations should do, but tend not to. One of the reasons administrations don't do it is because imposing ideas onto communities is always very difficult. And what we've done from the beginning is to work what we call on the front line. So we don't present our ideas to planning commissions and other bodies. We work with 50 people in the community who are going to object if we don't talk to them. And so the exercise has really been one of working, we call it frontline working. So instead of us doing planning in our studio, we do planning on the ground. We work, and we've spent 10 years on many different projects. So in the same place where we're working on the traffic, this was the seafront. This region is characterized by rather beautiful fishing villages. The fishing villages were destroyed because they built roads in front of them. Then, in order to stop the cars getting wet, they built walls. And so the village, which was defined and had its character from the sea, or becomes isolated. So we then do the planning. Administrations don't have the resources to do it. We then do the planning. We talk to the people in the village about what our intentions are and get them on board. And then we work with the local authorities and the local administrations and try and force them to carry out. So this was, this was before, this is after. Extremely simple exercises of improving public space, but ones that have, I think, a profound effect. Read the competition brief and the information. It's frustrating to some degree for my team of young architects to be writing competitions for other architects to win them. But on the other hand, we believe that we can do more by this process than we would by doing bad competitions. Yet another competition that we did, this was one where we were asked to work on the project, and we completely took the project away from them and redesigned the task. It's the competition was won by Campinos, a rather good architect, so this is on its way. We're working with Finza, which are a timber company. So, I mean, we're getting more and more involved in the whole process of commissioning and helping mayors and administrations commission architects, because without a proper commissioning system, you can't have an architectural infrastructure. This is a study we did with Roy and his team with MIT. So another aspect of our work is to work with other institutions and research institutions, the University of Navarra, and we work with the community on lots of different subjects. In this case, the issue of forestry and the problem of eucalyptus, and the regeneration of the rural industries. Processes are mapping, fieldwork, analysis, data visualization, and the one that's the most difficult, which is governance, of persuading administrations to adopt our plans. What we're working towards is a territorial plan for the region to convince the government that all decisions of development must be done in an integrated manner, that the consequence of all things should be understood. That means that you've got to look at the whole system of transportation, of mobility. You have to look at the issue of waste and pollution. You have to look at the idea of water. You have to look at settlement, etc., etc. And you can't look at them separately. Government tends to look at everything in vertical ways, and we are proposing and advocating, as many others do, a more horizontal perspective of a region. Finally, 2 years ago, so we're coming up for 10 years now of these activities. As I say, the team has grown. We've now taken up a new headquarters in the middle of Santiago. We have research studios where the team is working, where we collaborate with other students and other experts. We hold conferences and discussions every week. That we have a public program. We have exhibitions of the work. The exhibitions become part of the discourse. Because what we've learned, of course, is that if you're going to have any influence, then the influence has to be with the community. So the foundation Casaria, which is our house, is a place which has developed over the last 2 years, and now coming up for our second year then, as a place of meeting. If you want to have people come to meet, give them food. So in the center of the house is a very good kitchen and canteen, which serves the staff, but also has become one of the more desirable destinations in the town. So the idea of the foundation and of Casaria as its representational base is to promote these concerns. So we do the research, we have accommodation, we bring researchers with us, like MIT and others, and we work with all of the different administrations. Increasingly, the house has become regarded as a sort of embassy, let's say, a sort of a place where people can come and talk, where we promote initiatives, where we become like a sort of surgery. So I would say it's a sort of very artificial way of practicing architecture. I can't suggest it as it doesn't. It's not a natural way of doing it. I don't see it as a model necessarily, but it has been interesting. I spent most of my life trying to persuade people to do things, and most of the time finding that architects are extremely unpopular and untrusted. And I would say this is the first time I've ever been trusted. That if you don't build, and if you work in this way, and if you could somehow declare yourself and declare your interests, as I think we all have as architects, to be committed to the common good, and if we can find ways of doing that, then I think we can find a better relationship with the society we purport to serve. Thank you very much.
Take one or two questions?
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you. We have time for one or two questions. If you do need to leave, please do so quietly and then out the side or the back doors upstairs. If you have a question, we have two microphones up here. Or I can just hand you this microphone.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. Somewhere in the middle of the lecture, I started to feel really uneasy because the introduction was so starkly different from the projects you were showing, the museums, these grand spaces, these gemstones. And I started to think of like how perfectly that form of architecture fits into this bleak world of developers and so on that you painted at the very beginning. I'm very relieved and grateful to see the ending of the lecture and the work that you're showing now with these small towns and working with the community on the front line. Yet a little piece of unease remains, which is, in order to get to this place that I get to work in such a way, do I need to become that star architect that you are, so that I can also do that type of work?
No, I tried to say that the difficulty for us as a profession is that we are never to be complicit. We can't pretend that we're independent of society, and that is both a good thing and a bad thing. On a project like Neues Museum, the great reward was that it was a collective project somehow, that it represented more than the brilliance of an architect. It had a meaning, and in order to have meaning, it has to mean something to other people. So, so there are the great highs of the fact that we are engaged. But of course, the other side of that coin is that we are also limited when it doesn't work. Right? We're limited by the aspirations that we don't conform to. And the struggle of our profession is how to find the right route. I think there are many architects who have worked very well by being highly, highly careful and selective about the projects they do. Let's take someone like Peter Zumthor. I mean, he's been extremely selective, and I think it's a very clever way of working. On the other hand, I decided, and first of all, I didn't live in Switzerland, so it was a different issue, and living in London was quite different. But also, it seems to me, and I'm still committed to that architecture shouldn't be a sort of minority sport. It shouldn't only be for the special moments. So if you're not just waiting for those moments when you can do the thing exactly how you want, you have to sort of get your hands dirty, and getting your hands dirty, you're not quite sure whether you're going to have a good influence or not. So I personally think that, I mean, I'm not sure which projects you mean. You mean the Korean building or the museums?
I'm from Zurich, so for example, the museum, the Kunsthaus in Zurich, or the majority of the projects before we arrived in Valencia, they make me feel somewhat. I'm an architecture student. They make me feel somewhat helpless. But if I'm a bystander, they make me feel helpless and like, oh, that's because these buildings fit so perfectly into this world by creating this contrast between the gemstones and the rest.
Well, I think museums have a particular. I mean, museums are bound to have a certain monumental presence. I mean, by definition. So,
I think this is many other hundreds of people here, so I'd love to continue the conversation more broadly if we can. But I do think this is a very important point about the civic role of buildings and the role of buildings like music, when you sometimes come forward and sometimes come backwards, but it all works together. I think it is actually getting a little late, and so I would like to, let's have one more question here. You can use the microphone here.
My height? Hello. I'm an architect specialized in inclusive design and accessibility. I'm a Fulbright visiting fellow at MIT. And I totally agree with what you said, and thank you for the presentation. We are losing relevance as a profession, and we are still stuck in old ways of designing that keep us disconnected from society. So what I would like to know from you is, what do you think it would take to radically transform architectural education? shifting architects away from the illusion of being creators and toward becoming facilitators of meaningful social change in the 21st century?
The question is, in what way should we reflect these questions in education, in architectural education?
What would it take to radically change architectural education that right now kind of keeps maintaining a toxic, in a way, environment that perpetuates this illusion of creators? And I feel that in my community back home in Eastern Europe, but I still feel it in other environments as well, that we still create exclusion through the built environment and so on. So we are basically really disconnected in many ways.
No. Well, I think it's difficult enough to know how the profession should change, but clearly it's very important that education institutions start to think in different ways as well. I think the difficulty for us is that we shouldn't abandon our core passions. You know, we shouldn't all become environmentalists and politicians and social engineers. We shouldn't abandon our core passion of architecture. And a belief that physical things are important. But I think if you think back before the sort of investment boom that we've had over the last 30 or 40 years, which has slightly colored the perspective, there was within the profession more of a sense that we were connected to housing, to building universities, and that connection seems to be lost, along with the loss of the role of the public sector. You know, the public sector itself has diminished, and along with it, proactive planning. And most of the things, and I suppose what we're doing in Galicia is essentially planning, but planning from an architectural perspective. So planning not as a sort of thing of efficiency, but planning to do with protecting quality, including beauty, including urban and social issues. So I don't have an answer to this, and that's why, you know, I said at the beginning, I find it more and more difficult to give lectures at the moment. I sort of feel more confused than ever in a way, because of the fact that we are having to look beyond what is naturally quite comfortable for us. But increasingly, one starts to feel that the tendency towards formalism that we have as a profession is looking a bit old-fashioned, and that our tendency to talk amongst ourselves is looking a bit old-fashioned. There's a sort of interesting anecdote within the foundation. This is the public floor where our canteen is and where the exhibition space is, and we have a conference thing here, but also on that floor we have the foundation team in the front. And on the other side, on this floor, I have a small commercial office. The income from that office pays, you know, the money just sort of goes downstairs to pay for everything else, so it sort of helps run the machine. So they are more conventional architects working on more conventional architectural projects. So there's 20 people working in the foundation, and there's 20 people working in the architectural office. The people in the architectural office hardly ever leave their desk. They sit there doing this all day, and 6 o'clock they run home. The people in the foundation are out all day. They're having meetings, they're discussing with people, and I would have to say they're so much more proactive because they're used to making things happen. And it's a very interesting comparison between the tasks that the conventional architects have, which is, in a way, to fulfill the expectations of the project, of the client, and the deadlines, and all of those things that they've got to do, the sort of boring stuff. And the other ones, and also a sort of anxiety that we're not going to do it right, and that the client's not going to be happy. And with a young team, I would say less experienced in some ways, nearly all Galician in the foundation, who have a sort of swagger. They're sort of arrogant a bit, because they think they're empowered, because they feel like they don't have to answer to anybody. They feel a little bit like they're doing the right thing. And so when is it that architects, when do we lose a bit of that swagger, I suppose? I mean, I don't think we've lost it completely. I mean, it's very anecdotal. It's not black and white. But I would certainly say that it's quite interesting to see these two teams perforce operate in a slightly different way. And I think that's because architecture has become a slightly autonomous thing. It's of course you have to deal with it. I mean, something like Neues Museum. The reason that Neues Museum was so wonderful is because it was a bit more like, ideas were made in the field, as it were, or made in dialogue, made, of course, there's a huge amount of drawing and technical work, and a shocking amount of technical work went into Neues Museum. But the creativity was much more dynamic.
Well, I think that is the perfect question to actually end with, because this room is a room full of architects, but it is also, above all, a room full of teachers and students of architecture. And I think the question that you began to answer about how we teach building as a verb at the level of society, at the level of our ecology, but also still very much at the level of building, is an incredibly important one. And I'm going to pivot quite deliberately here to say that it is one I'm very excited about in the context of our next year's lecture series, which will be under the leadership of my colleague Anna Majacki, and in the context of our new building, which is itself a piece of adaptive reuse. And I invite you all to join us, as we don't claim to have a conclusive answer to this question, but we do fundamentally believe it is the most important one to be asking right now. And so for all of the answers you've begun to provide tonight, David, I would like to thank you again on behalf of all of us. Thank you.